Here are some important rights to know about wages. You have the right to specific wages under state and federal law. First, the minimum wage. Your employer must pay you at least the minimum wage for every hour you work. Even if you are paid by what is called a piece rate, that is, paid by the box or by the pound, you still must be paid at least the hourly minimum wage. It is important to protect your rights by keeping track of your work hours in a calendar, a diary, or a journal. In Minnesota, the minimum wage for each hour of work is $8.63 if you work for a small employer. In Minnesota, the minimum wage is $10.59 if you work for a large employer. These minimum wages went into effect in Minnesota on January 1st, 2023. In North Dakota, the minimum wage is $7.25 for each hour of work. Overtime pay. Some agricultural workers have the right to overtime pay. That is, pay at 1 1/2 times their normal rate after working a certain number of hours in each week. For example, if a worker normally earns $10 for each hour of work, the worker would earn $15 per hour of overtime work. Overtime laws depend on what sort of work you are doing and in what state you are working. In Minnesota, almost all agricultural workers have the right to overtime when they work more than 48 hours in 1 week. Some workers who earn a guaranteed, predetermined weekly salary do not have the right to overtime. In North Dakota, agricultural workers usually do not have the right to overtime pay. Minnesota cannery workers. Most workers who work in canneries have the right to overtime pay when they work more than 40 hours in 1 week, no matter which state they work in. Most migrant cannery workers in Minnesota also have the right to receive at least 70 hours of pay during any 2 consecutive weeks of work for the minimum work period listed in their contract. Deductions from your pay. Unless it is required by law, your employer usually cannot deduct money from your pay without your written permission. You should receive a pay stub every time you are paid. The pay stub must include information about any deductions, as well as the hours you worked, even if you are paid by a piece rate, and the rate of pay. The pay stub you receive from your employer must contain important information, including the following: the total number of hours you worked in that pay period, the rate at which you were paid, the list of any deductions made from your pay, the employer's physical as well as mailing address, and the employer's telephone number. It is important to protect your rights by keeping copies of your pay stub. It is also important to review your pay stub each pay period to make sure they show the correct number of hours worked and the correct amount of pay received. The right to employee notice in Minnesota. In Minnesota, your employer must provide you with a written notice at the start of your employment. The notice must contain important information, including the following: your employment status and whether you are exempt from minimum wage, overtime, and other state wage and hour laws, and the reason why you are exempt from those laws. It must also include your rate of pay, including whether you are being paid by the hour, shift, day, week, if you are being paid by a salary or by piece rate, or if you are being paid by commission or another method. Your notice must also include a list of deductions that may be taken from your pay. Finally, your notice should also include your employer's physical as well as mailing address and telephone number. Your employee notice must be in English. You can ask for the notice in another language. Employers must provide you in writing any changes to the information in the notice before the date the changes take effect. Your employer may not retaliate or take negative action against you for asserting your rights under wage laws. When should you be paid? Most agricultural workers should be paid at least every 2 weeks, and never less than 1 time per month. When your job ends, you may have the right to be paid sooner, depending on how the job ended and in which state you were working. In Minnesota, if you were laid off or fired from your job, you should be paid within 3 days if you were a migrant cannery worker. You should also be paid immediately after giving a written demand for your pay to your employer. If you quit your job, you should be paid within 3 days if you were a migrant cannery worker. If you were a migrant worker doing other work, you should be paid within 5 days. You should never have to wait more than 20 days to receive your final pay, no matter what work you were doing. If you are not paid on time, you can give your employer a written demand for your pay. For an example of how to write a demand letter to your employer to receive your pay, please see the Agricultural Worker Project's 2023 calendar. In North Dakota, you should receive your final wages by the next regular payday after your job ends, no matter how it ended. It is important for you to know that if your employer does not pay you on time, you may have the right to a penalty. A penalty is additional money that your employer may have to pay you. In Minnesota, your employer may have to pay up to 15 extra days of wages if you worked in Minnesota, and up to 30 extra days of wages if you worked in North Dakota. In Minnesota, you need to give a written demand for your pay to your employer before you are eligible to receive this extra penalty. Again, if you wish to see an example of a written demand for your pay, please consult the Agricultural Worker Project's 2023 calendar. Protect your rights by writing down your hours. It is important to keep track of your work hours, including when you arrived at work, when you left work, and what breaks you took, if any. This will help you to recover your correct wages. It is also important to write down the name of the person you worked for, their address, phone number, and license plate number. If you wish to receive a calendar from the Agricultural Worker Project to help you keep track of your hours, please contact our program.